A bedroom is quiet except for a clock. Curtains are not fully closed. On the table, water catches the last light, and a notebook lies open. For much of history, sleep was understood through stories, habits, dreams, fatigue, and nerves under strain. Later, physicians built rooms for rest, measured hours, watched patients through the night, and tried to name private experiences. Those rooms and ideas reveal a changing medical language of rest. Sleep is the subject, but the deeper history is how people learn to notice it. The room is ordinary until its objects are read together: bed, chair, basin, folded shawl, book face down, a letter, spectacles, shoe brush. Often the sleeping room was never only for sleep. It could keep dressing, illness, evening visitors, or a child who would not settle. The same walls had to manage privacy and household traffic. Sleep arrived among objects that had to be moved, covered, or left near at hand. The window mattered too. A shutter kept out noise or wind. A curtain softened lingering light. A crack in the frame could make the room cold. Before electric light, the room was tuned with a lamp, a candle, or a low fire. The night was not empty or silent. Carriages, floorboards, coughs from another room, and a settling house all entered. The body slept inside them. Time sat on the mantel or shelf as a clock face, a pocket watch, a bell, a servant's call, the routine of a household. Night was divided by these small instruments. They made sleep into duration rather than darkness. In homes shaped by work, prayer, and fixed meals, the clock could feel moral, reminding people when silence was expected and when it was safe to remain still. In hospitals and infirmaries, time became formal: a night round, a ledger entry, a lamp carried down a corridor. Sleep was part of an order that could be observed. In the sick room, night had its own furniture: a stool, basin of water, bell cord, chair turned toward the sleeper. Someone sat close enough to hear breathing change, perhaps a relative, servant, nurse, or attendant. The work required patience, listening, and attention to small changes: a cough, a turn, a pause, a hand reaching for water. Sleep in such a room was never fully solitary. One body lay still while another kept watch. The bedding carried meaning too. Sheets were washed and remade. Blankets could be rough or softened by use. Some beds had feather mattresses, some straw, some other fillings that held heat differently. A pillow could sit high or low. A coverlet could make the air under it feel heavy or thin. They changed temperature, touch, and the sense of being held in place. Medical writers noticed because the sleeping body responded. A room too warm, too cold, too drafty, or too tight could alter the night. Linen became part of the history of rest. Bedrooms also collected the day: a coat over a chair, a basket of laundry, a prayer book, letters, a child's toy, a mending kit, a ledger of household accounts. In rooms where space was scarce, sleep had to live beside work. People dozed in shared rooms, near kitchens, near sewing, near other bodies moving through evening. Privacy was uneven. Some households could afford a separate chamber. Others used one room for every purpose. Rest was tied to rent, labor, age, kinship, and the shape of the house itself. The room made sleep possible, but it also set its limits. Older medical systems linked sleep to balance, digestion, heat, and the turn of the hours. The body was thought to change with food, weather, age, and emotion. A heavy supper might matter, as might grief, long labor, or pressure. Sleep sat among these concerns as part of the body's larger rhythm, not a blank interval, but part of the pace of life. Morning and evening, waking and drowsing, hunger and fullness, motion and stillness. People looked at the room, then at the day that filled it, trying to understand why sleep had been easy one night and hard the next. As medical language changed, sleep moved closer to the nerves. What had been called weakness or unease came to be linked with strain, exhaustion, sensitivity. The bedroom did not disappear. It became more important. A quiet room could shelter strained nerves, and a noisy room could threaten them. Light, bells, traffic, household movement, and constant attention entered the explanation. The room before sleep became one place where modern life left its mark on the body. Rest was still private, but no longer left entirely to private language. Institutions turned these ideas into architecture. Hospitals, clinics, convalescent homes, and places of retreat arranged beds in rows, separated spaces by purpose, and assigned attendants for the night. Curtains, corridors, and schedules created managed quiet. The room itself was meant to reduce distraction, ease observation, and give the body a setting in which it could settle. A ward was not just where ill people slept, it was where sleep could be watched, counted, and compared. Silence in such places was built, maintained, and often fragile. Not every household could offer anything like that quiet. Many rooms were shared by children, relatives, lodgers, or workers moving in and out. Some sleep took place near ovens, in attics, in back rooms, or in chambers that had to serve another purpose by morning. The question of who was allowed to rest and where was bound to class, gender, age, and labor. Children were put to bed earlier. The sick were moved closer to heat when possible. Others kept working while the rest of the house slowed. Sleep was also a household arrangement, depending on space, quiet, and a door that could close. Once sleep became something to be studied, paper came closer to the bed. A physician might note hours, appetite, agitation, or waking. A patient might keep a diary and write down the shape of a night, a dream, or the sound of rain on the roof. These records did not make sleep less private. They made it more legible to medicine. Night could be turned into entries, margins, and case notes. Rest entered the archive, and medicine learned to separate ordinary tiredness from a lingering complaint. The clock and the notebook belonged together. One measured duration, the other held sequence. Between them, sleep became a matter of intervals. How long, how often waking returned. Whether heat, worry, noise, coughing, or a vivid dream broke the night, writing those details created a different kind of attention. Sleep was no longer only something that happened under the blanket. It could be compared with the previous night and with the condition of the tongue, appetite, temper, or morning face. The room was linked to the record cabinet, and the record cabinet linked the room to medical judgment. At the same time, sleep remained stubbornly private. No ledger could keep a half-remembered dream, the relief of hearing the house grow still, or the unease that kept a person turned toward the wall. These experiences lived in the body before they reached writing. A hand rested on the coverlet, a breath slowed, a face turned from the window. Someone listened to rain, street noise, or the faint shifting of others in the house. The room before sleep was made of small permissions: shoes by the bed, a lamp turned down, a book closed, a day set aside. Such gestures seem ordinary until history places them in a wider frame. In time, rest itself would be prescribed, and rooms would be built to enforce stillness. Quiet would become routine, then treatment. Yet even before those stricter arrangements, the sleeping room already carried medical meaning. It was where fatigue gathered evidence, watchful households listened for change, and the body announced its limits without words. A pillow, basin, clock, curtain cord, and folded blanket were not dramatic objects. Together, they formed the setting in which sleep became visible to medicine. Their silence was part of the record, so the story begins in a bedroom that looks ordinary until its objects are read together. The clock divides the dark, the water waits on the table, the notebook holds the edge of thought, the curtain softens the window, the bed gathers cloth, heat, and memory. Around these things, medical history would make its careful approach, bringing in words like fatigue, nerves, insomnia, and convalescence. It would place charts beside pillows and institutions beside homes, and keep the old room in view for medicine. But before those terms fully arrived, there was already the quiet labor of arranging a room for rest and noticing. Night after night, the body kept its own schedule. This was the room before sleep, never only empty. It was one of the first places where people learned that rest had a history. A clock on the stair landing can seem as ordinary as a coat hook, yet it carries an authority the older night once did not know. Before clock faces settled into homes and public rooms, darkness was answered by shutters coming down, a fire tightened, a watch changed, a bell called across roofs. Night was not empty, it was marked, but only roughly, by use and habit. In many houses, the difference between one night and another was felt in weather, season, work, and company. A winter night pressed close and long. Someone might mend by candle, listen for a child, or sit by a window and keep track of the dark. Such hours were lived through in pieces, by errands and sounds. At the bedside, the measure was often improvised, a mother waking to a cough, a servant feeding the fire, a relative listening for the breath of the sick room. Each kept a private arithmetic of the night. That arithmetic could be exact in feeling and impossible to transfer whole onto paper. It belonged to care before science. Some communities divided the night by prayer or civic duty. A bell at a chapel, a tower, or a gatehouse did not hand out exact minutes. It gave the hour as a public event. A watchman carried lantern and staff through streets. A monk or servant could take the next turn by hearing the same sound. The night was social as well as private. On a ship, in a port, or on a city wall, the watch changed hands by routine rather than exact minute. One person took the lantern, another took the next circuit. The task was to remain present inside the dark, not to divide it into fixed slices. Small timekeepers did exist. A marked candle, a sandglass, a pocket watch, or a clock in sight could sharpen the sense of passing hours. None made the dark vanish. They simply made it divisible. Once the night could be split, it could be compared with yesterday or with someone else. That comparison changed what sleep meant. It was no longer only rest, it was also a span that could be described. Mechanical clocks gave that span a more rigid shape. A face with hands turned the hour into a regular unit, used in records. The same hour could now be repeated on paper, spoken aloud, and carried in memory. Pocket watches extended the reach of the clock beyond the wall. Written time preferred the same shape every day. That preference suited record-keeping. It also taught people to hear their own nights in a new way, as if the body were always being compared to a standard the body did not invent. A phrase like "after the second bell" or "when the lamp was low" could still survive in speech, but the page began to favor the exact hour. Medicine learned quickly from that habit. Once time could be trusted as a measure, a note about sleep could become more exact. A doctor, nurse, or family member might write down when a person lay down, when sleep came, when waking returned, and how long the wakefulness lasted. The page began to separate sleep into intervals. That did not make the night simple. It made the night legible to the eye, and therefore available for comparison and worry. A line across paper can make a restless night seem orderly, and an orderly line can make it seem more troubling than memory alone would. One short sleep beside another short sleep starts to look like a pattern. One broken night beside a fuller one can invite explanation. The standard does not simply measure, it also persuades. It teaches the observer that a certain kind of night should look a certain way. The same habit appeared in hospital books and bedside slips. A penciled entry did not have to be elaborate to matter. A few words were enough to make a night durable. Asleep, awake, restless, drowsy, disturbed, better, worse. Such entries could be placed side by side, and once they were side by side, a person's nights began to look like a sequence rather than a blur. Bodies, however, do not become clockwork because paper prefers regularity. Pain, coughing, hunger, grief, work, caregiving, and travel interrupt sleep. In many lives, the night remained uneven, and its unevenness had causes that could not be corrected by looking harder at the clock. The measured hour could describe the interruption, but it could not remove it. That gap between the number and the lived night became one of the tensions in medical history. A simple schedule could also flatten differences. One room hot, another drafty, one patient anxious, another calm. Medical history repeatedly had to learn that the line was not the thing itself, and that a quiet sheet, a still body, or an empty chair could hide very different nights. Later language would call this a circadian rhythm, the daily timing system that responds to light and dark. That language belongs to a later period, but the human relation to morning, dusk, and darkness is older than the term. People long understood that the body answered to sunrise, to lamp, to weather, and to the arrangements of daily life. The older records lacked the scientific vocabulary, but they did not lack the experience. Institutions gave the clock even more power. In hospitals, asylums, and other care settings, time was not only observed, it was managed. Bells marked meals, rounds, waking, bathing, and the closing of rooms. Lamps were tended, corridors quieted, and attendants moved in regular routines. Sleep was no longer confined to the private household. It was something a setting could encourage, interrupt, or report. Institutional time made night visible to people who were not sleeping. A quiet ward could suggest recovery, a restless one, pain or fear. A patient who slept soundly might satisfy the schedule, while another might draw closer observation. Night, once heard as general darkness, became a sequence of conditions that could be listed, checked, and compared. The archive preserves that change in plain objects: a bedside clock, a ward register, a penciled note, a chart with columns for hours, observations, and remarks. Together they show a culture learning to ask not only whether someone slept, but how, when, and for how long. That set of questions seems ordinary now, but it was not always so. To ask for duration is to believe it can reveal something real. That belief slowly reshaped the language of complaint. A sleepless night became insomnia, fatigue, or a sign of nervous strain, rather than a vague bad stretch of darkness. Wakefulness could be separated from the rest of the day and given its own place in the account. Once that happened, the physician could begin to distinguish habit from disorder, a difficult night from a recurring one, a person who simply needed time from a person whose nights needed explanation. The names changed the questions. The change did not make the older night disappear. There were still uncounted hours in kitchens, on roads, in sick rooms, and on ships where the body kept a different schedule from the bell. But measured night had become powerful enough to organize expectations. It stood behind the bedside clock and the ward round. It made rest appear as something that could be tracked. It made waking appear as something that might need a cause. From here, the path toward nerves becomes easier to see. A drawer of case histories can keep more than names. It can keep the slow arrival of a medical idea. The pages are narrow and ruled, and the ink has bled where fingers touched them. In the margins, a physician keeps writing the same note: sleep broken, nerves weak, fatigue that does not lift, a body too restless to settle after the day is done. The words are ordinary, but the pattern is not. They show medicine beginning to sort complaint through the nerves. For a long time, sleeplessness was explained through digestion, grief, hunger, dreams, temperament, or night air. But in the 19th century, the nervous system gained special authority, linking sensation, movement, feeling, and wakefulness. A person could be weak in the nerves, not only in blood or stomach. That gave doctors a way to speak about a body that seemed unsettled without obvious injury. An anatomical plate makes a hidden system legible. Once nerves are pictured that way, it becomes easier to imagine them strained, overused, or too active for too long. The system can be excited, weakened, or spent. Sleep enters the same language. It becomes when the system is supposed to quiet itself, gather itself, and stop answering every small demand. A sleepless night no longer looks merely private. It can become evidence. If a patient wakes at the smallest sound, lies awake after the room has gone still, or feels no refreshment by morning, the casebook may point toward the nerves. The complaint may include headaches, trembling, weariness, irritability, or a mind that will not lie still. None of these signs proves one single cause. They let physicians describe a nervous state that crosses from mood into the body. The consulting room becomes a place of sorting. A question about sleep sits beside questions about appetite, work, recent strain, and the ability to bear interruption. The doctor is trying to learn how much the person has been asked to keep together. In medical writing, the result is called nervous weakness, nervous debility, or nervous exhaustion. The labels are loose, and they gather a wide range of complaints without a fever or visible wound. It also captures the feeling of being too sensitive to ordinary life. A sharp sound, a crowded room, a stretch of intense attention. The body is imagined as having thresholds, and beyond them it stops recovering cleanly. What matters is that the system has had to answer again and again. Sleep becomes the measure of that answer. When it comes easily, the body seems to have reserve. When it does not, reserve itself comes into question. There is also the wider world outside the casebook. Offices fill with papers, streets move faster, messages travel by wire, lamps stay lit later. Medicine borrows that atmosphere without reducing the body to a machine. Nerves seem to carry impressions like a circuit. If the signal is too strong or the system too tired, the result may be exhaustion rather than rest. Once that way of thinking becomes established, quiet starts to seem medically relevant. A shaded room, a softer voice, fewer visitors, less reading, fewer interruptions. These are already part of a medical logic. The room itself becomes a support for a system that is being asked to stop straining. The record does not speak with one voice. Some physicians still blame digestion, others emotions, heredity, work, or habits that stretch over months. The nervous vocabulary absorbs them. It can name symptom, cause, or effect. Its flexibility helped it spread. It was broad enough to reach people with obvious illness and complaints that never settled into a single organ or tissue. The nervous system became a place where uncertainty could be kept on the page. A casebook page rarely tells a whole life. It lists the present: poor sleep, a startled body, a mind that will not drop into rest, fatigue, and no clear sign that the trouble has a simple border. Such notes are small, but they change the scale of diagnosis. Sleep is no longer merely the opposite of waking. It is evidence of reserve, a sign that the body can release the day and return from it. When that release fails, physicians suspect not a bad night, but a nervous condition, making night harder to enter. In that setting, the question of rest grows more serious, not as laziness, not as a moral verdict, as a condition that might let the system settle after too much response. The next rooms are quieter, with fewer callers and longer hours on the bed, sparing the nerves from fresh demands. What began as strain edges toward stillness. The casebook makes room for the idea that doing less may belong to medicine. That is where the idea is heading now. The nervous, sleepless, and exhausted patient are starting to overlap. Once nerves become central to explaining wakefulness, sleep is no longer only what happens when the day is over. It becomes one sign by which medicine judges the whole person. Soon, rest will be written into the record as something a body might need, and quieter rooms will look like medicine. On a desk in the consulting room, a sheet of paper lies beside the inkstand, and the handwriting does something plain. It does not name a rare drug or a dramatic procedure. It writes a limit. It writes rest. That small word becomes more than kindness or hope. Once rest is written down, it can be carried home, repeated at the bedside, and entered into a casebook. It is a simple line on paper, but it opens a history of medicine managing days, rooms, and bodies by asking for less. That order rarely means one exact thing. It may mean a day indoors, a week away from ordinary duties, a period in bed, a quieter chair near a window, or the refusal of strain. It can mean fewer visitors, less reading, less speaking, and less movement through the house. It can mean that the body is spared demand while it gathers itself again. Sleep may or may not come, and that uncertainty matters. Rest is not the same as sleep. Rest is what medicine tries to arrange when sleep cannot simply be commanded. By the 19th century, physicians increasingly used the language of nerves, fatigue, and exhaustion, and rest became a way to answer complaints that did not point to one injured part. The patient might seem worn down rather than wounded, unsettled rather than plainly sick, and the consultation needed a remedy broad enough for that condition. Rest suited many kinds of weakness. It could be attached to convalescence, nervous distress, overstrain, recovery after illness, or the slow return of strength after a body had been pushed too far. Medicine did not invent the desire for repose. Families had long kept a fevered child still, left a tired relative undisturbed, or quieted a sick room when the body needed less noise and less effort. What changed was the authority attached to that quiet. The doctor's written word gave rest clinical shape, moved it into the record, and defended it as treatment. The room around the patient changed when that happened. A bedroom was no longer only a place for sleep at night. It became a managed space. Curtains were adjusted to soften light. A basin sat within easy reach. A carafe of water, a folded shawl, a side chair, and a screen helped preserve order and quiet. Books might be moved aside. Visitors were limited. Ordinary domestic objects became part of treatment because they reduced effort. The room did not become empty. It became selective. Hospitals used the same logic, entering rest into charts, rounds, and ward instructions. A patient might be kept in bed after fever, weakness, or another condition that made movement seem unwise. A cot, a chair, or a screened corner could protect stillness. Nurses recorded meals, hours, and visible changes. The day's rhythm slowed around the patient, and rest became organized routine. The distinction between sleep and rest mattered here. Sleep could happen, fail, or arrive unpredictably, but rest could be prescribed even when sleep remained uneven. A physician might ask for quiet before asking for certainty. The body might be awake, yet still judged to need less demand. That let rest travel across different kinds of illness. It could be linked to the aching aftermath of exertion, recovery after childbirth, nervous strain, episodes of weakness or weariness shown in speech, posture, appetite, and pace. This is why the prescription for rest stayed so close to the everyday rhythm of the household. Once the word was spoken or written, someone had to make room for it. Meals shifted, a chair was moved, a door was left shut, a household member answered visitors so the patient would not have to. Households with servants or spare rooms could manage it more easily. Households without those supports could not. The prescription looked simple on paper, but its cost was hidden in labor, care, and space. That hidden cost gave rest a social dimension physicians often ignored, even when they depended on it. A doctor could write quiet, but quiet had to be built, and exertion was not equally optional for everyone. The prescription therefore reached beyond the patient's body and into daily life. It touched work, wages, caregiving, and the division of tasks inside the home. Rest became a medical command that relied on domestic cooperation and exposed domestic limits at the same time. It also sat beside other therapies that asked for a lower level of strain. Diet might be simplified, baths might be scheduled, air might matter, sleep might be encouraged indirectly through a calmer setting and fewer interruptions. Rest rarely stood alone. It belonged to a wider medical effort to reduce pressure on a body thought to be overtaxed. In manuals and case notes, the language could remain brief and practical. Keep quiet, remain in bed, avoid exertion, do not receive visitors. The brevity itself is revealing. Medicine was trying to govern a day with as few words as possible. The paper trail mattered because it made those words durable. A prescription sheet could be shown to a relative. A casebook could preserve the note for the next visit. A chart could carry the order from one shift to the next. The body's condition became legible through these records, and rest became something that could be repeated across days. What had been a spoken recommendation turned into a repeatable sequence, and that organized duration made rest powerful in medical history. That is why the same brief instruction could move from note to note, day to day, and room to room without changing its form. Its power came partly from that repetition and partly from the fact that it could be understood without much explanation. A single line could keep a whole household rearranged. Even a small prescription could become durable because everyone around the patient had to respond to it. Yet the neatness of that duration was often fragile. A room set aside for quiet could also become a room of waiting. The patient might listen for footsteps in the hall or count the minutes until evening. A clock on the mantle could make the day feel longer rather than shorter. A prescription for rest could bring relief, but it could also create scrutiny and begin to feel like a test. That pressure helps explain why rest gradually took on an institutional shape. In clinics, infirmaries, boarding houses, and later specialized institutions, rest could be made more consistent than a household alone could manage. A curtain was drawn. A tray was carried in, a visitor was delayed, a patient stayed within a narrower range of motion. Even before the rest cure became a familiar label, the idea of protected stillness was moving toward routine. Medicine was arranging surroundings so the body might be less interrupted. The quiet objects in those rooms tell their own story. A covered jug, a folded blanket, a side table, a screen, a chair left unused, a stack of letters unopened for the moment. Rest was built from ordinary furniture and ordinary pauses. There was also an older moral language around it. Rest could sound sensible, even virtuous, when it marked recovery from strain, but suspicious when it looked like refusal or idleness. Medical writing framed rest as rational management and a reminder that the body had limits. That claim was useful when diagnosis was uncertain. Sometimes the safe answer was to lessen the burden first and watch what changed. Some patients could manage the slower rhythm only because other people did the work around them. Others could not. The same order could land very differently in different rooms. By the time rest was written as prescription, it had become a way of giving the overstrained body a smaller world. The word was plain, but its consequences were wide. It altered rooms, households, records, expectations, and turned quiet into a task with a place in the chart. The paper lay on the desk for a moment longer, the ink drying, while the room around it settled into a different pace. The paper on the desk does not stay there. It moves upstairs, folded into a napkin or carried on a tray, and reaches a bedroom already made up, the curtains drawn softer, and a chaise longue waiting by the wall. The rest cure begins with these plain objects. They are not medical instruments, yet each one helps define what the patient is allowed to do once the prescription reaches the room. The tray, bell cord, basin, folded blanket, and chair set too far from the bed help narrow the day until the nerves are supposed to settle. In its familiar form, the cure meant bed rest, seclusion from ordinary demands, generous feeding, and steady attention from a nurse or attendant. Reading, writing, long conversations, useful work, and anything likely to stir the mind were often discouraged. Massage could be added, and sometimes electrical treatment. The promise was simple: less motion, less interruption, and more nourishment might let the overstrained body gather itself again. The simplicity made the method persuasive and easy to carry into rooms where the patient had little say. That logic fit the nervous diagnoses of the late 19th century. A person who looked worn, irritable, sleepless, or unable to keep pace with ordinary life could be described as exhausted rather than visibly injured. The rest cure gave that exhaustion a shape the doctor could point to. Used most famously on women, especially those labeled hysteria or neurasthenia, it seemed rational. To the person in bed, it could feel like the world shrinking to a timetable. The practical life of the room made that shrinking visible. A covered tray arrived at regular hours. A sponge and basin sat ready for washing. Fresh linen was pulled tight, then pulled tight again. A chart recorded meals, hours in bed, appetite, and the return, or lack of return, of strength. The patient became a set of permissions: when to rise, when to speak, when to lie down again. The chart made the day look orderly from a distance, even when it felt like pressure. That pressure depended on the house. A rest cure was easier to imagine in a home with spare rooms, servants, and money enough to replace the labor the patient could not do. It was much harder where work could not pause, or one room had to serve too many purposes already. The treatment belonged to class as much as diagnosis. It assumed a helper would answer the door, carry the tray, fold the blanket, and keep the world away. In one household, that might resemble care. In another, it might be impossible. The silence could be harder than the bed. For many patients, the most punishing order was to stop writing. A notebook, a half-finished letter, a sketchbook, a page of private thoughts. These were small places where a person could still arrange a self. Once set aside, the cure reached beyond the body into the room of thought. The patient might lie still and feel the mind circling, resisting, filling the quiet with movement. That silence was pressure without release. The body did not remain neutral inside that pressure. Muscles weakened. The first effort to sit up or stand could feel strange after long confinement. A person kept still too long can lose confidence in motion. What rest was meant to restore could be weakened by stillness. The bed stopped looking temporary and became the room's default state. Return to movement was a difficulty. The complications were not only muscular. Boredom, irritation, fear, and loneliness settled into the room with the tray and pillow. A nurse reminded the patient that ordinary independence had been removed. The closed door could protect a fragile system, but it could also make every footstep in the hall sound louder than it was. A cough, a key turning, a voice outside the doorway, all weighed more in a life reduced to waiting. The cure promised calm and sometimes delivered strain from distance and enforced patience. Medicine often explained failure by asking for more of the same. If the patient did not improve, the rest could be extended. If strength did not return, the silence could be lengthened. The logic was circular. Improvement proved treatment, and non-improvement did too. A room built for recovery could become a room where explanation kept the patient in place. Later accounts show how strange that logic could feel from the bedside. A woman might be told her mind needed quiet, while quiet itself was distress. She could be urged to trust the treatment while losing the actions that made trust possible. The physician's confidence lived in the chart and the diagnosis. The patient's life lived in the room, with its basin, curtains, tray, and hours. Those two forms of knowledge were not equal. One was written in the record. The other felt like confinement disguised as care. The rest cure also changed the household around the bed. Letters were answered by someone else. Children were directed around the closed door. Meals arrived at fixed hours and left by the same route. The house became a small procession of helping hands, each one reducing the patient's need to move. It looked generous from outside, but it made dependence feel complete. The cure gave rest, but staged dependence as order, teaching the household to organize itself around stillness and then call that healing. At the edge of the treatment, visible devices gave it a more modern look. Massage was easier to trust when the hand giving it could be seen. An electrical apparatus, when used, made nervous illness seem answerable to force beyond talk alone. Medicine liked the appearance of action, especially when the complaint was hard to pin down. But the visible part could not settle the deeper question. Did the patient need less strain, silence, and control over every hour? The treatment had one answer. The person in the bed often had another. That unanswered question is one reason the rest cure matters beyond its own moment. It shows medicine turning domestic stillness into something organized, repeatable, and supervised. The bedroom starts to resemble a small institution. The tray, basin, nurse, chart, and bell cord can travel into other settings. The same logic travels toward convalescent homes, clinics, and sanatoriums, where air and routine join. The bedroom was never just a bedroom once this happened. It became a prototype for the quieter spaces medicine would continue to build. Yet the room itself remains the most revealing object. A chaise longue by the window, a folded blanket at the foot of the bed, a pitcher that has to be brought in and carried out again, a chair waiting for a visitor who may not enter. Nothing in the room announces a crisis, and that is part of the design. The rest cure often looked plain, even polite. Its complication was that it made a private life smaller while leaving the furniture unchanged. The room stayed neat. The life inside it did not always stay whole. A gravel path circles the building before breakfast. Along the porch, wicker chairs face the light, each carrying a folded blanket or wool rug. The furniture is arranged for sitting, not wandering. In sanatorium life, air is not a backdrop. It is something to be managed, like linen, fuel, and meal timing. The room does not end at the wall. It continues into the terrace, the lawn, and the line of trees beyond the fence, where a patient can spend long hours without being left alone with the weather. That idea grew from older habits of rest, but the sanatorium gave it a larger scale. The private bedroom held the person still. The building stood apart from the town, where smoke was thinner and the horizon could feel wider in daylight. Many of these places stood outside the center of town. The sanatorium held stillness in a corridor system, with porches, galleries, dining rooms, and a desk where the day was written down. Fresh air and sunlight were believed to matter, especially in tuberculosis care, and the building was planned as if air itself could be invited, ordered, and used. The whole institution leaned on it. The morning began with a bell. Windows were opened, beds were straightened, blankets were shaken into shape, and the washstand became active before the patient had done much more than wake. A tray appeared for breakfast in the dining room, where the tableware was plain and serviceable. The point was regularity. The meal came at the hour it was due. The day was introduced by sequence: wake, air, eat, sit, observe. Paper made the routine visible. Someone entered weight, temperature, appetite, and other signs the staff thought worth following. The patient's body became a line of figures and notes that moved from one day to the next. A chart could show whether the air, rest, and food seemed to be helping, or whether the day was too full, too short, too cold, or too uneven. After breakfast came the long-seated hours. Chairs were placed on porches, under awnings, or in open galleries so the patient could remain in the weather without quite being exposed to it. A blanket might be drawn around the shoulders, tucked under the knees, or folded over the feet. The point was endurance made gentle. A resting body was not left to drift. It was positioned, covered, and returned to the chair again and again. The grounds mattered because the route mattered. A short walk along gravel, a turn past a hedge, a pause at a bench, then back to the porch could count as part of treatment. Not every patient walked, and not every day allowed the same amount of movement, but the idea of moving air through the lungs sat inside the design of the place. Trees, slopes, fences, and paths became part of the care map. That was one reason these places could seem both open and strict. The air was free, but the schedule was not. Conversation was limited in some settings. Visitors were controlled. Reading, sewing, and small handwork might be allowed, but not as a full return to ordinary life. The institution did not simply offer rest, it organized rest. For someone worn down by cough, fatigue, or nerves, the predictability might feel like relief. For someone who wanted to move, work, or leave, the same predictability could feel like confinement. The sanatorium also depended on hidden labor. Laundry rooms kept the linen supply moving. Kitchens sent out trays. Attendants carried blankets, emptied basins, and answered bells. Someone had to keep the chairs dry, the porches swept, and the charts in order. A quiet ward was never simply quiet. It was the result of schedules, hands, and repeated tasks that made the place look as though it had paused on its own. For tuberculosis especially, the logic was plain enough to its supporters. Before effective drug treatment changed the landscape, fresh air, nutrition, rest, and steady routine carried much of the hope. The sanatorium did not replace medicine so much as stretch the meaning of care. It said that the environment might do part of the work that pills could not yet do. If air was healing, then a closed window looked suspicious. If routine was healing, then interruption looked like a threat. That language reached beyond the lungs. People labeled exhausted, overwrought, nervous, or weak were already living inside a culture that treated quiet as a remedy. The sanatorium carried that logic into a larger apparatus. It gave rest a porch, a bell, a record book, and rules to keep the body from slipping back into old habits. Yet the old tension remained. Rest could be prescribed, but not always welcomed. A person might need silence and resent it. A person might need to be watched and dislike being watched. The same room that promised ease could make the self feel smaller. Access to that promise was uneven. A sanatorium asked for travel, time, and a place in the institution, and those things were never evenly available. Some people could leave work or home for a long stay. Many could not. Some could live among porches and charts. Others had to remain in crowded rooms where rest was interrupted by labor, family, and noise. So the sanatorium belongs not only to the history of medicine, but to the history of who was permitted a protected interval and who had to keep living without one. By late afternoon, the shadows lengthened across the porch boards, and the chairs began to face a different light. The day did not end abruptly, it thinned, and the regularity that governed breakfast and the porch was supposed to make the night more stable. Trays were gathered, blankets were folded, and the chart on the desk received its last notes. The patient could feel the routine closing around the hours like a soft door. Nothing dramatic happened. That was part of the point. The sanatorium wanted the day to pass in measured increments, as if steadiness itself might be a kind of medicine. The sanatorium had not invented rest, but it had given rest a corridor, a porch, and a timetable. That was enough to change the feeling of an ordinary day. In a place like this, air was not just air, and quiet was not just quiet. Both were arranged, rationed, and made to serve the long attempt to steady body and mind. For now, the building keeps its slow order, and the air moves through it like something borrowed, held briefly in the hands, and set down again. In that borrowed air, a person could spend a day made of pauses and learn how deeply a pause can be arranged. In that borrowed air, the lamp becomes the room's next authority. A shade softens the glow, but not the fact of it. The chair, washstand, rug edge, and folder of papers by the bed return under a light that does not belong to sunset. A room at dusk can be entered by darkness or by light kept on purpose. Once that happens, night is no longer only a natural closing. It becomes a managed interval. Sleep history turns toward these devices because they changed how evening felt. It also changed how much of the day could be carried into the dark, and that quiet extension mattered to rooms, routines, and sleepers alike, because the evening no longer ended on its own terms, and the boundary between work and rest grew less certain. Oil, gas, and candlelight had already altered evening before electric bulbs spread through homes and institutions. Flame gave the room a moving center, but it also asked for care. It smoked, dimmed, and made every surface look temporary. A person watched the wick, the match, the trim, the refill. Electricity promised steadier light, less labor, and a room that could stay usable without tending. That steadiness mattered for reading, nursing, sewing, and account-keeping after dusk. A brighter evening was not just brighter, it was longer. A room with a lamp could become many rooms in one evening. The same chair that held a resting body in the afternoon could keep a newspaper, sewing basket, letter, or ledger after supper. The same table could carry a glass, a lamp base, and papers that did not belong to sleep at all. Light extended the usable surface of the home. It made corners available and work possible after the day should have been loosening. It was part promise, part strain. Clocks were a different kind of object. They did not brighten anything. On mantles, walls, or in pockets, they turned time into something visible. The face of a clock made the hour public. Everyone in a room could see the same minute moving forward. In a bedroom, a clock might be comfort or accusation. In a corridor, it was order. In an office or ward, it was authority made of brass, glass, and a steady tick. Rest cures, sanatorium routines, and other systems of regulated repose depended on that authority. Meals came when the clock said they came. Visits were limited by the schedule. Sitting, lying down, walking, and being left alone all had assigned times. The room of stillness was never outside administration. A nurse, maid, or physician could look to the dial and decide what happened next. Rest was something arranged in pieces with intervals and limits. The bedside table changed too. Under lamplight, it could keep letters, notes, invoices, or names. A line in a book marked a visit, a meal, a waking, or a complaint. In institutions, the lamp made paperwork possible after dusk, and paperwork made the night legible. Rest history is record history. Once sleep was watched, it had to be written down. Electric time made the arrangement more exact. Clocks, linked by wiring or a central source, could repeat the hour across many rooms. Time became less a matter of one careful hand winding one clock, and more a shared system that spread through a building. Offices, schools, railways, hospitals, and hotels learned to trust that shared hour. A corridor bell and a wall clock could work together. The result was discipline. A watch on a chain could be worse than a clock on the wall because it brought time close enough to touch. In a sleepless hour, that small case in the palm made the minutes feel heavier. One glance told a person not only that it was late, but how late. The room held accountable night. For some, it was reassuring. For others, it sharpened wakefulness. Insomnia gained the exact minute. Later, sleep medicine would link sleep to light and dark, but the experience is older. A room lit after dark can keep attention awake. A lamp over a table can prolong reading, mending, writing, and waiting. Once the room stays open, the mind often stays open with it. The body does not always agree with the light, but the light still presses evening forward. At home, the lamp became a companion to letters and newspapers as much as to sewing or prayer. The evening could extend into work that was neither labor nor rest. Sometimes it was simply longer wakefulness. A room with no bright corner allowed the day to fade. A room with a lamp invited the day to linger. That lingering could be pleasant, or it could leave the sleeper with less darkness before morning. Outside the room, the city was being reshaped by the same logic. Street lamps pushed back the dark. Shop windows shone after sunset. Factory rooms, railway stations, and telegraph offices kept hours, unlike the body's preferred ones. The old certainty that night would end the day had weakened. Time moved through schedules and public systems. A person could stand under a lamp on a street corner and feel the city still awake elsewhere, even if a private bedroom had already gone dim. Public time also carried its own habits of proof. The clerk stamped a card. The superintendent checked a register. The messenger noted an arrival. The school bell, factory bell, and station clock belonged to a world that trusted repeated signals more than feeling. A person could be praised for punctuality, even while exhausted, and blamed for delay, even when sleep had been cut short. The body and the schedule did not always agree, but the schedule usually won on paper, making fatigue look personal when it was often structural. That shift was uneven. Some rooms had their own lamp and trusted clock. Others borrowed light, shared time, or worked with whatever was available. A private room with a dimming lamp offered a different kind of rest from a crowded room ruled by a common schedule. Access to quiet and to the hours needed for sleep was never evenly spread. Rest has always been tied to who could afford a room that closed and who had to stay open for others. In a ward, the lamp made night duties possible. A nurse could read the chart, check the room, or answer a bell without lighting the corridor. The clock at the station gave staff a common measure for rounds and handoffs. What had once been a loosely felt stretch of night became a sequence of tasks. That sequence helped order care, but it made the institution awake differently from the sleeper's wakefulness. The building had a nocturnal life of its own, and the clock gave it rhythm. Electricity also belonged to measurement. Wired clocks or signals made it easier for a building to stay aligned. That alignment carried moral weight. On time meant orderly. Drift meant suspect. Sleep sat uneasily inside that culture because the wall could be mastered while the body remained unsettled. Medical writing began to lean on that exactness. Nervous strain could be linked to hours, schedules, and overfull days. Fatigue became a condition gathered under artificial light and repeated demands. Yet the clock did not explain everything. A person might sit beneath a bright bulb and still feel exhausted, or watch the dark without sleeping. The lamp and the clock changed the scene, but they did not solve the mystery. By the time a person reached the end of such a room, the lamp and the clock had done their work together. One enlarged the evening and made night more usable. The other divided it and made it accountable. Together they created a new kind of darkness in which rest could be planned, interrupted, timed, and recorded. The old night was not gone, but it no longer ruled alone. When the lamp was finally lowered, the room did not return to a simple world. The clock still stood there, keeping its count as the building settled, and beyond the window, the city kept its own more exhausted pace. A brass time clock stands near the factory door, its face dulled by soot and fingerprints. Beside it, a ledger lies open to arrivals, departures, and missed hours. In the industrial city, fatigue entered the record before it entered the conversation. Counted at the gate and stamped into the day, it went home in the bent shape of a lunch pail. The city did not wait for sunrise. Whistles from mills, bells from workshops, and rattling vehicles broke the morning before many rooms had cooled from night. Leaving early meant a schedule made by machines. The walk to work, the climb of stairs, the hours standing or turning a wheel, and the return after dusk all drew from the same reserve. That made fatigue easy to notice and hard to place. Supervisors saw slower hands, small errors, dropped tools, and missed time. Clerks met it in blurred columns and wandering attention. Physicians heard it in weariness, poor sleep, headaches, and the feeling that a night's rest had not reached the deeper strain underneath. One worker's fatigue came from lifting, another's from standing still, another's from carrying figures until the figures seemed to keep going after the page ended. The city tied them together by hours. Long shifts, short pauses, and irregular nights pressed on different lives. Factory floor and counting room were not the same, yet both were asked to run on the same schedule. Electric light did not solve that imbalance. It prolonged the workday in some districts and pushed real darkness farther away in others. Windows stayed bright above shops, in newsrooms, over clerks' desks, and on upper floors where accounts had to be finished. The city borrowed more from the night, and fatigue accumulated in the borrowing. Fatigue became a civic word, meaning overwork, poor ventilation, bad light, crowded rooms, or a nervous system that seemed to keep its own account of strain. Urban labor had changed the balance between effort and recovery. The route home often added another layer. Tram cars and crowded pavements delivered tired bodies into noisy districts. By the time a lodging house or tenement door closed, the body had crossed more than distance. It had crossed a measure of strain. At home, rooms were rarely only for sleep. A coal scuttle stood by the stove, a wash basin waited on the shelf, a mending basket sat near the chair, and folded clothing asked for hands after supper. Evening labor competed with evening rest, and the city followed people indoors through smoke on the curtains, sounds in the stairwell, and the unfinished work of the day. Sleep in the industrial city was often thin because the room itself never stopped being a room in the day. A mattress might be taken up and put down, a pail carried across the floor before dawn. The body tried to keep to its own schedule, while the room kept one schedule for all its uses. Under those conditions, fatigue was not cured by lying down. It had to wait for the household to become quiet enough to make lying down possible. Public institutions saw the same tiredness in different forms. Factory inspections, municipal reports, and clinic notes tried to sort strain into columns. They recorded hours, complaints, accidents, and absences. They also showed fatigue was often a result of arrangement, where work was placed, how long it lasted, how much air moved through the room, and how little slack remained in the week. Sometimes a hospital ward, a dispensary, or a charity room was one of the few places where the city did not immediately ask for labor. Even there, rest was organized by schedules and rules. A chair, a curtain, a corridor bench, and a nurse's attention marked the difference between collapse and recovery. Some places made still smaller concessions: a bench in a corridor, a lunchroom with water, a quiet corner away from the machine room, and a waiting room where chairs stood in a row. These did not undo the city's demand. They only admitted that endurance had limits. Rest arrived in fragments, often borrowed, and often too brief to feel complete. That is one reason fatigue could be spoken of as both physical and moral. To some observers, it suggested idleness, weakness, or poor habits. To others, it pointed toward a mismatch between human endurance and industrial expectation. The same ledger that praised attendance could also reveal how thin the line had become between tiredness and exhaustion. In that sense, fatigue was a judgment about time as much as about the body. Noise made the problem harder to ignore. Wheels on rails, boiler rooms, street cries, and doors shutting in stairwells followed people into the evening. Sleep had to pass through these layers of interruption before it could settle anywhere. It was not simply the opposite of labor. In the industrial city, sleep had to compete with labor's afterimage. The burden also reached people not stamped onto a time card. Messengers, laundry workers, shop assistants, and household workers lived in the same narrow margin. Their fatigue was less visible in a ledger and more visible in the way a head dipped over a basin, in the hand that paused on the stair rail, or in the silence that settled after the last chore was done. The city spent strength in many places at once. By the time night deepened, fatigue had become a common language. It named the strain of the mill and the office, the corridor and the carriage, the room upstairs and the street below. It did not solve the problem it described. What it did was make exhaustion thinkable as something shared, produced, and observed. Soon the question would shift from how tired people felt to how rest itself might be tracked, written down, and compared. The city's fatigue, once named in streets and factories, found a quieter form in a side room off the ward. Under a shaded lamp, a ledger lay open beside a wall clock. The paper was ruled so tightly that each night's entry looked almost like a stitch. One column held the hour of going to bed, another held the hour of waking. Between them sat a narrow space where the dark had been reduced to a line of ink. These pages did not yet explain sleep. They only made it visible enough to compare. That was a large change. A private night could now be carried into a clinic, folded into a casebook, and set beside another night from another person. The first measurements were plain to the point of disappointment. A patient might be asked when the lamp went out, whether there had been a long spell of wakefulness, how many times the night broke, and what the morning felt like afterward. Some notes were written by the sleeper, others by a nurse or physician. A few were copied into household books beside expenses and deliveries, as if rest belonged among the ordinary accounts of the day. Such records were rough and relied on memory, but they did something decisive. They turned sleep from a feeling that vanished on waking into a sequence that could be reviewed later. Sometimes the record was made because a treatment needed proof, a change in schedule, a quieter room, a different meal hour, a period of enforced rest. Each could be followed across several nights. The page answered the practical question before the theoretical one. Did the body settle? Did the intervals shorten? Did morning fatigue ease? The procedure was ordinary enough to be overlooked, yet it made a lasting claim. Rest was not just felt, it could be tracked. In the rest wards and sanatorium corridors, the night register added another layer. An attendant moved from bed to bed with a pencil and a watch, not to interpret dreams, but to record the interruptions of the night. One patient turned repeatedly. Another woke early and sat upright before settling back. Another slept through the round so quietly that the page only showed a blank span between checks. The register did not capture the inner life of sleep, but it gave the institution a way to see patterns in the dark. The clock shifted too. It no longer belonged only to work, trains, and supper. It marked the interval between lying down and rising, separating time in bed from time actually asleep, even when the separation had to be guessed. A long night was not always a long sleep. A short night was not always a poor one. Physicians and physiologists approached the same problem from another angle. In a small room with a thermometer, a stopwatch, and a revolving drum that drew lines on paper, they watched the body around sleep. Pulse, breathing, temperature, and movement all offered hints. None of them was sleep itself, but each could suggest how the body entered it or moved away from it. The drawn lines looked precise, yet they were still only traces. A body could be still and not asleep. It could be restless and still be sleeping. The difficulty of the task sat at the center of the method. That difficulty pushed record-keeping into a more careful form. Margins filled with remarks about noise, pain, weather, a cough from the next room, or the uneven heat of a crowded house. A column alone could not explain why one night collapsed and another stretched longer. The page became a small map of conditions, not just a tally of duration. What counted was not only how long rest lasted, but what surrounded it. The earliest measurements borrowed from the everyday world of streets, houses, and workplaces. They made room for the fact that sleep was never entirely separate from the life around it. Measurement belonged to an age of accounts. Factories counted output. Offices counted minutes, railways counted departures, and medicine began to count its own observations in the same disciplined way. Sleep entered that culture as a kind of balance sheet for the body. Rest became comparable with authority and suspicion. Some of the clearest records were the simplest: a date, a bedtime, an hour of waking, a note in the margin about a bell, a fever, or a child in the hall. A physician might glance across several nights and look for a pattern that the sleeper had not been able to keep in memory. Nights could be compared across weeks. A change in the room, the food, the hours, or the surrounding strain might appear as a change in the record. The person who had once described only a vague misery could now present a line of entries. The line did not settle everything, but it made the complaint durable. The act of recording did not merely describe sleep, it trained attention toward it. Nurses learned to think in intervals, physicians to ask the same question on successive mornings, and families to see that a night could be broken into parts. In some homes, the record traveled in a pocket notebook or stayed beside the bed with a pencil tied to the cover. In hospitals and convalescent houses, it went into cabinets of casebooks, where the page sat with temperatures, weights, and notes about appetite. Sleep was one more feature of recovery, though never a simple one. A person might eat well and still lie awake, or sleep through the night and remain unwell. Early measurement learned this slowly. children's rooms, and convalescent houses made that lesson harder to ignore. A family notebook might note the hour a child finally stopped turning, the sound of a cough before midnight, the nap that came too early, or the morning when the sleeper rose angry and pale. Sleep was no longer sealed off. It could be read against appetite, tempers, headaches, and the long drag of recovery. Even so, the records remained stubbornly human. A page could say that a person was in bed for 10 hours and still fail to show the long stretch of wakefulness inside those hours. It could note a fitful night and still miss the deeper unease that made the body listen for every sound. The early measurers did not yet have a way to see into the sleep itself, only around it. They captured the frame first, leaving the picture inside partly hidden. Blank spaces mattered too. A line left empty could mean the observer was absent, the lamp was not lit, or the household had grown too tired to keep writing. A crossed-out hour, an uncertain guess, a repeated word. These traces allowed later readers to see not only the sleeper, but the labor of watching. Measurement was never separate from the people who performed it. The watchfulness itself followed a rhythm. A nurse returned at regular hours. A mother checked the child before sleep and again before dawn. A physician came back the next morning to ask the same questions. These repetitions mattered because they made the night reproducible in speech. That reproducibility is a kind of measurement, even when no instrument is in the hand. The body may be private, but the schedule around it can still be shared. By the end of this stretch, sleep had acquired a new kind of public shape. It was still private in experience, but no longer beyond comparison. Physicians could speak of long, short, broken, or routine improved nights. They could also see how easily the record slipped from the body into the story about the body. That was useful and dangerous because numbers can make a night look tidier than it ever felt. These early attempts did not solve the mystery. They taught medicine to expect sleep to be approached indirectly. Before the machine, there was already the habit of counting. Before the laboratory, there was already the page. When the casebooks were closed and set in a drawer, the nights did not disappear. They became comparable in another room, under another lamp, where the doctor could return to them later. A line from one week could be set beside a line from another. A quiet change could become visible only after the fact. The measurement worked by delay as much as by attention. For now, the ledger stays open in the side room, and the room stays still. Beside the open ledger in the side room, a smaller notebook waits with bent corners and softened pages. It can slip into a pocket or rest on a washstand. Only paper, thread, and a blunt pencil. Yet it matters because it catches what sleep would otherwise lose. A person wakes, writes a line, and tries to keep the night from breaking apart. A dream fragment, an hour awake, a room too warm or too still. The fact of rising before dawn can fit on a page. Long before sleep became a measured subject, people were already using paper to keep a fragment of the night in place. Dreams are difficult to keep. They arrive with force and leave almost at once, thinning into scraps before the face has been washed. Private notebooks, margins, and small memoranda mattered because the page preserved only the remainder: the stairway, the stranger, the closed door, the field, the voice gone by morning, the feeling of having been somewhere else. In households, dreams might be repeated at breakfast as stories or warnings. In medical writing, they were compressed into brief description. The same image could shift meaning as it moved from one setting to another. What had been a family tale could become a symptom, a clue, or another line in a casebook. By the 19th century, insomnia had become a word physicians used for suffering that could not be inspected in a jar or measured by the pulse alone. It named the hour that would not pass, the bed that would not settle, the morning that came too soon. Doctors asked, when sleep began, how often it broke, whether the mind stayed active, whether dreams came too vividly or not at all. Those questions turned private misery into something that could be reported, compared, and filed. A calm face in daylight might conceal a night split into pieces, and the complaint had to be carried by speech, notation, and memory. Many of the most revealing records were not made for doctors at all. A blank leaf in a household memorandum book could keep a line about waking at 3 or a dream lingering into the morning meal. Some people used school books, recipe cards, or the backs of letters. Others wrote to see a pattern, if enough nights were placed beside one another. The page allowed comparison without drama. It did not explain the sleeplessness. It set one night next to another and let their differences become visible. A week of poor rest could be followed by a week of shallow sleep, then a short entry saying only that the dream returned, plain, but not empty. It let the sleeper become their own witness. In hospitals and asylums, the same habit appeared under stricter light. Night notes, ward books, and round sheets reduced a difficult night to a few lines. Slept, woke, murmured, was restless, asked for water, did not sleep. Such words seem thin, but they were often the only way a night entered the institution's memory. A nurse's note stood in for many small interruptions. A doctor's chart turned interruption into sequence. Still, it preserved repeated waking, the dull sameness of some nights, the sudden strain of others, and the labor of watching. Dreams were treated with similar caution. Some medical writers placed them among the effects of fever, digestion, worry, or the excitable nerves. Others gave them a more inward role, as signs that thought did not stop when the body lay still. Either way, the dream was rarely left alone. It was interpreted, sorted, or filed away as something to remember if it happened again. A dream was real to the person who had it and uncertain to everyone else. It resisted proof and changed with every telling. That uncertainty made private records unusually important. The diary did not settle what a dream meant, but it preserved the fact that it had occurred. The letter did not cure insomnia, but it could carry the shape of a night across distance. A patient might write in the first person, with embarrassment or relief, and a physician might read the same words later with different eyes. A family member might note repeated rising from bed or early waking before dawn. One line in a margin could change the color of an entire page. A notebook that looked plain at first glance might contain the slow accumulation of weeks. The night returned, and the paper returned with it. Records also show how sleep changed when it was addressed to an audience. A diary written only for the writer could be fragmentary, even cryptic. A chart meant for a practitioner tended to compress feeling into categories. A letter to a relative might soften the complaint. The same night could appear as complaint, evidence, confession, or routine, depending on who was expected to read it. Once a night could be read by another person, it became part of a conversation about the body, the household, the nerves, or the institution. Some writers kept their nights in strict shorthand, others used fuller prose, as if the length of the sentence might keep restlessness from slipping away. The smaller records often carried more than sleep itself. A dream note might include the room, the weather, a sound from the street, or the fact that the writer had gone to bed worried and awakened with the same worry still in place. An insomnia entry might mention a headache, a bell, a hard chair, a cough from the next room, or the smell of coal smoke drifting through a window. These details are not decoration. They show that sleep never stood alone. It was shaped by house, climate, occupation, illness, grief, and interruption. The private page caught those surroundings in a way a formal chart often could not. A few words on paper could preserve the feel of a mattress, the annoyance of a creaking floorboard, or the knowledge that a child was stirring in the next room. Later, many of these pages would be gathered into bundles, folders, and boxes, the kind of slow archive that preserves handwriting as well as meaning. A dream note from one year could rest beside a hospital page from another. A correspondence file might include an anxious mention of sleeplessness, a physician's reply, and a private list of broken nights. The collection does not flatten the difference between those voices. It keeps the difference visible. One writer is trying to explain a feeling. Another is trying to sort it. The history of sleep often survives in exactly that uneven company. The record is not impartial, and neither is access to it. Time to sit at a desk, paper to write on, a lamp left burning after the household had quieted, a room not shared by too many interruptions, all shaped who could keep a private account of the night. Some people had that chance, many did not. A servant, a patient in a crowded ward, a worker rising before dawn, or a parent tending others through the dark may have had only scraps of memory instead of a notebook. Their nights still existed, but they entered history in thinner lines. Even the power to describe insomnia was unevenly distributed. That imbalance gives the small notebook its weight. It is a quiet object, almost forgettable, and yet it tells a larger story about who was permitted to notice sleep, who had a place to write it down, and whose wakefulness passed without paper. The page beside the ledger keeps the night from disappearing entirely, but it also shows how selective survival can be. One person's dream is preserved in ink, another person's is gone by breakfast. The difference is in the room, the hour, and the hand that had time to stay awake with a pencil. A new page hangs beside the ledger, clipped to a ward door. It is only a roster, a narrow list of names and hours, but it makes a hard point. Rest was not something the body simply entered when it grew tired. It was scheduled, supervised, and sometimes denied. One name meant a bed, another meant a chair by the lamp, a bell to answer, a basin to carry, a cup to rinse, a window to open before dawn. The page shows how rest has been tied to permission. In a sick room at home, that permission was hidden in ordinary objects. A bell pull hung by the pillow. A jug stood on the washstand. Folded linen waited on a chair. A tea tray, a spoon, a covered dish. A half-open curtain made the room seem settled, but someone else kept it settled. A relative brought broth. A servant changed the sheets. A child was told to keep still in the hall. The person in bed was said to rest, but the household worked around that sleep, carrying it in steps and errands. Physicians who wrote about nerves often turned stillness into treatment. In private rooms and better houses, patients were told to lie down, limit visitors, reduce reading, and keep to a narrow routine. The bed became a boundary. A screen could split the room in two. Curtains could be drawn. For some, this was relief. For others, confinement. The prescription promised quiet, but it also exposed a fact. Long hours of lying down were easier to enforce when money, staff, and spare rooms were there. Outside such rooms, the clock kept a sharper pace. In factories, shops, kitchens, laundries, and offices, rest arrived in fragments. The pause between customers, a counter chair, a hurried lunch pail, an apron over a stool, the factory bell, the office whistle, the kitchen fire, and the workday itself decided when a body could stop. For seamstresses, laundresses, clerks, and domestic workers, fatigue stayed labor because a missed hour meant lost pay, and lost pay meant a harder night. A person with a diagnosis could be told to stay in bed, while another with the same heaviness in the limbs was told to keep going. Tiredness fell unevenly. In some circles, it was treated as a condition worthy of attention. In others, it was a private failing, hidden behind a straight back and a steady face. Sanatoriums and convalescent homes carried that pattern into architecture. Veranda chairs, wool blankets, small tables for reading, dining bells, rooms with air moving through open windows. Meals came at set hours, walks were measured, and conversation could be limited. The place separated recovery from ordinary noise, yet admission, length of stay, and comfort depended on recommendation, charity, or payment. Rest, even built into a house, still had a gate. Hospital wards offered another version of the promise. There, the ward clock, chartboard, basin shelf, and bell cord ordered the night. Sleep was never only sleep. It was interrupted for rounds, fresh water, or a turn in position. The patient might be drowsy, but the institution was awake. Nurses, attendants, and orderlies carried out the work that let others lie still. For the poor or the confined, hard mattresses, shared blankets, narrow beds, a rising bell, and a locked door created order. To be put to bed could mean being watched, counted, and kept in place. Rest sounds gentle, but institutions used it to mean compliance. Children met this unevenly as well. A nursery cradle, a small blanket, and a lamp, left burning low, might suggest protection, but childhood did not automatically bring leisure. Some children were sent early to bed because adults wanted silence. Others were kept awake by errands, cramped homes, or work that began before the body was ready. The back kitchen tells the same story. A coal scuttle by the stove, a mending basket, a kettle left to hiss, a dishcloth on a nail. There, the chance to lie down depends on who else is on their feet, and the person who keeps the fire alive often gets the least visible rest. The papers may name the mistress in bed, the child with fever, or the patient in the ward, but less often the hand that rinsed the cups, closed the curtains, and stayed awake. A similar unevenness appears in the places where people waited to move: a railway bench, a station lamp, a parcel tied with string, and a timetable pinned to the wall made a temporary room out of transit. A traveler with money could sit, doze, and miss the next train without losing the day. A porter, driver, clerk, or mother with children and bundles had far less room for that pause. Motion itself was unequal. Some lives had the chance to stop between departures. Others were told to keep moving until wakefulness and exhaustion blurred. Public places made rest conditional too. A park bench, a library chair, a church pew near the back, and a waiting room seat offered brief stillness, but only on someone else's terms. A person could be moved along for lingering too long, or for sitting down at all. The bench was there, but the right to remain was not always there with it. Doctors and employers both knew how useful a note could be. A slip of paper, a diagnosis entered in a margin, or a signature beside a request for leave could make fatigue legible to someone who controlled time. The same writing could protect a patient from accusation or turn rest into a temporary exception. Without that paper, tiredness was easier to dismiss. With it, tiredness could interrupt a schedule. Even then, rest had to be earned, defended, and justified in language that could be believed. Writing also turned a private interval into history. A notebook beside the bed, a letter from a convalescent house, a diary, or a physician's case record. But the most burdened often left the faintest trace. Their tiredness appears indirectly in household accounts: delayed laundry, a missed shift, or a child's plain remark that someone was too exhausted to speak. That uneven record matters. It means the past does not only tell who rested, it also reveals who disappeared into usefulness, their fatigue absorbed by the room around them. Archives preserve the rooms where rest could be formalized. Admission books, duty rosters, prescription slips, and convalescent registers turn quiet into paper. Far less survives for the nap in a workshop corner, the child asleep on a folded coat, or the servant who sat down for a minute and rose again when the bell rang. That uneven paper trail makes the historical question sharper. If rest was a human need, it was still governed by class, gender, age, and institution. The page tells who was seen resting. The silence around it hints at everyone else. So the question is not only who was tired, it is who had a room, a chair, a note, a servant, a wage, or a reputation that allowed tiredness to become rest. The roster by the door, the bell by the bed, the blanket on the veranda, the coal scuttle in the back kitchen, and the timetable each keep that question open. Rest appears in the records as an absence from work, a pause in motion, a quiet hour that someone else had to cover. The shape of quiet is made by walls, routines, and the people allowed to cross their own threshold and lie down. The roster by the door gives way to a floor plan, a section drawing, a sketch of where beds, passages, and windows will go. Quiet in medical history is often designed before it is heard. The hinge, the wall, the distance between one bed and the next, the point where a hallway turns away from sleeping rooms, all decide how much of the world reaches the person at rest. A room is never only a room, it is permission in timber and plaster. The old sick room gathered a few objects near the body: a washstand, pitcher, basin, small table, chair, screen, folded coverlet, tray. Each had a task, but together they formed an envelope around the bed. Curtains filtered sight and softened edges. Screens marked a pause in movement within the room. Even the floor could cooperate, with a runner to mute the step. In rooms built for convalescence or nervous exhaustion, light had to be managed rather than welcomed. A shade lowered halfway, a shutter left ajar, a curtain drawn over the bright side of the bed, a veranda or balcony that let air enter without bringing the street with it. These were ways of negotiating exposure. The room could be bright without being harsh, open without being noisy, sheltered without being sealed. Balance shifted with weather, season, class, and the labor available to maintain it. Sanatoriums took that balance and spread it across the landscape. Buildings stood apart or stretched into wings and pavilions, so one noisy corridor would not govern the whole house. A chair on a terrace, a blanket folded over the arm, beds set where the light reached them, a sheltered path between buildings. The site itself became part of care. Quiet came from distance as much as softness. Trees, gravel, and open air shaped how sound traveled and where the eye could rest. Outside the walls, gardens and paths softened approach. A nurse pushing a chair onto a terrace, a patient looking across a lawn, windows facing trees rather than traffic. These were not trivial details. The view itself could be part of quiet, giving the eye something steady and the ear something less hard than the street. Many institutions that prized rest placed themselves at the edge of town or in broad grounds to keep the road at a distance. A bench, a gravel walk, a courtyard, and grass between buildings turned the area around the room into a buffer. A bed stripped to essentials could look almost severe: iron frame, narrow mattress, white linen, a simple stand beside it. Yet that spareness served a purpose beyond tidiness. Fewer objects meant fewer corners to clean, fewer places for dust to gather, fewer distractions for an unsettled mind. The bed also became a stage for routine. Meals arrived there, notes were taken there, visitors were counted there. Sleep did not sit apart from the rest of the day. It shared a small patch of furniture with attention, appetite, boredom, and observation. Quiet was not only built, it was maintained by people whose work stayed out of the frame. Floors were washed, polished, or swept with care. Doors were closed with hands that knew how not to slam. Trays were carried level. Carts moved on quieter wheels when they could. Shoes changed their sound at the threshold. Nurses, attendants, servants, and family members learned a discipline of motion that made a room feel still. Silence was labor, a sequence of small corrections repeated so often that they vanished into habit. The schedule board and the bedside chart belonged to the same architecture. So does the ledger kept in a nearby office, with columns for arrivals, departures, meals, sleep, and restlessness. Paper gave the institution a second floor plan, one made of entries rather than walls. If the room was calm, the record explained whether that calm was expected, interrupted, or temporary. The same room could mean very different things depending on who lived around it. A spare bedroom in a house with money could be turned over to rest with a screen, a bowl of water, slippers, and visitors elsewhere. A crowded boarding house had fewer options. A kitchen chair, a sofa, a curtained corner, a child moved to another bed for the night. These makeshift arrangements show how unevenly quiet was distributed. The architecture of rest was often also the architecture of privilege. It took extra space, extra hands, and extra privacy, all easier to find in some homes than in others. In mental hospitals and other institutions for nervous illness, quiet rooms could carry two meanings at once. They were described as places to lower stimulation, where the noise of a busy ward might be held back and a troubled mind given less to answer to. Yet the same plain room could also make separation easier, and separation is never only comfort. A blank wall can shelter attention, but it can also deny company. A room built for calm can also become a room built for control. Hallways, side doors, and service stairs mattered because they kept the noisiest traffic away from the bed. Laundry could move one way, trays another, deliveries and waste another still. Public visitors took the front route, staff took the back. Even the circulation of bodies through the building helped decide whether the sleeping rooms felt sealed off from the day. A house or hospital that wanted quiet had to think like a map maker. Where does the clatter go? Where does it stop? Which passages widened and which narrowed so one movement does not wake 10 more? Sound was only part of the problem. Sight had to be managed too. A room with too many ornaments, open drawers, too many visitors, or too much movement around the bed can feel restless even when it is not loud. So the quiet room was often simplified: fewer pictures, fewer piled textiles, a table kept clear except for water or a book, light held back just enough to blur the edges. A curtain across the doorway gave the eye a place to stop. The material of the room changed its character. Plaster held one sort of echo, wood another, tile another. Thick curtains absorbed sound that bare surfaces would return. A mat on the floor, a rug in the corridor, felt under a chair leg, all changed the way a footstep landed. The room became a small acoustical arrangement. Though few people would have used that word in daily speech, they would have called it snug, private, peaceful, or simply quiet. Not every quiet room was meant for sleep. Some hospitals and homes set aside day rooms, sitting rooms, or small libraries where a person could remain still without lying down. A chair beside a window, a newspaper folded on a table, a shelf of books, a knitting basket, a deck of cards, a tea tray left until later. These objects gave rest an upright shape. They mattered in long recoveries, when the bed could feel too narrow and the ward too bright, but complete withdrawal was not wanted. Even there, time stayed present. The clock in the hall marked when the room changed from day use to evening use. Lamps shifted, voices fell. The chair was turned toward the wall. A nurse or attendant made the same circuit one more time, checking the window latch, the blanket, the water, the door. The building did not drift into silence. It was escorted there. That is what the architecture of quiet finally reveals. Rest is not a blank space left behind by activity. It is a place made, guarded, and remade, so a body can lie still while the house keeps moving beyond the door. The night nurse did not enter an empty room. A key ring caught the lamplight. A report book rested against one forearm, and the sleeping ward opened as a row of narrow beds with blankets smoothed flat, water glasses near the rails, and basin and towel within reach. The light was small, but enough to make the room readable. Bed frames, curtain edges, a folded shawl on a chair, the pale curve of a pillow, and the dark doorway beyond the ward all belonged to one arrangement. Nothing was accidental. Every object had been placed for someone who might need it without fully waking. In a private bedroom, sleep can disappear into darkness and leave little trace until morning. In a ward, sleep is public in a quiet way. It is managed by rounds. A latch is checked, a blanket is drawn up, a window is eased for air, and a bell cord is left within reach. A nurse or attendant keeps making the circuit because the room only works when someone keeps it working. That labor is easy to miss. On a trolley or narrow table at the end of the aisle, there might be a pitcher, a basin, fresh towels, a pencil, a clock, and the night register waiting for the next entry. A nurse learned where to stand, how far to lean, and which hand could reach a cup without bumping the bed rail. The ward was not simply a room full of beds. It was a map of reach and restraint, designed so care could move quietly from one patient to the next without turning every visit into a disturbance. That movement ended up on paper. The register did not keep a full story, but it held the shape of the night. A line might note that a patient slept well, or that someone was restless, woke often, needed attention, or did not settle until late. The pages recorded how sleep behaved where several people were trying to sleep at once, and not all of them succeeded in the same way. One bed might keep a deep sleeper, another, a patient drifting in and out, another, someone staring at the patch of light under the door, another, a body too uneasy to surrender fully to the mattress. The sleeping ward earned its name because sleep was desired there, not because sleep arrived evenly. It contained drowsiness, wakefulness, fear, relief, and the stillness that can appear between them. The room was never one state only. It held a range of human night, all close together under the same roof, that mattered in hospitals, sanatoriums, asylums, and other institutions where rest, observation, and recovery were arranged by schedule. The line between care and surveillance could be thin. The same lamp that preserved sleep also made movement visible. The same chair let a nurse watch the room. A cough, a foot on the floor, a call for water, a hand lifted from under the blanket, or a patient asking what hour it was all entered the night as minor events. Nothing in the ward was more ordinary than interruption, and nothing required more discipline than responding without making a larger disturbance. The ward changed the meaning of sleep by changing its surroundings. At home, sleep could sink into family life, shared but often unseen. In the ward, sleep became collective and supervised. Beds were arranged so the nurse could see down the line. Screens or curtains offered a little privacy, but the larger room remained open to attention. The sleeper was part of a managed field of bodies. Night nurses learned that field by sound as much as by sight. They learned the soft metal tap of a basin set down too quickly, the creak of a board near the foot of one bed, the rustle of linen when someone turned, and the small cough that meant a person was not as asleep as the room first suggested. They learned how the lamp threw shadows across a pillow and how a hallway footstep could travel into the sleeping ward before the person making it appeared at the threshold. Yet it shaped the night as much as any printed rule. The labor could vanish by morning. Fresh staff might arrive to find blankets straightened, jugs refilled, and a floor cleaned. The quiet room could look as if it had always been that way. A calm ward does not prove that calm happened on its own. It proves that someone made room for it, one small correction at a time, while the rest of the building kept moving outside the door. Institutions gathered people for many reasons: illness, weakness, recovery, observation, poverty, age, or the absence of any other safe place to be. In those settings, sleep could become a measure of privilege as well as health. A clean bed, a manageable noise level, a nurse within hearing, enough distance between bodies, and a room that did not grow too hot or too cold all mattered. The sleeping ward was one answer to those needs, and a fragile one. It tried to create rest inside a crowded system, to make quiet from a building that never fully stopped being busy. That attempt had limits. Rest could be organized and still remain vulnerable. A person might lie in a well-kept bed and still not sleep. Another might fall into sleep only to wake in confusion, grief, fear, or simple discomfort. Sleep was never only a matter of the hour or the mattress. It depended on temperature, on memory, on pain, on the sounds of strangers in neighboring beds, and on the shape of the day that had come before it. The ward made those influences visible. It showed that insomnia was not always a private failure, and that sleep was not just a habit a person could choose at will. Both were shaped by the room. The night round ended with one more circuit before dawn. The book was checked, the water was checked, a blanket edge was touched. The nurse paused to listen for the first sounds of the building changing its own rhythm. A door closing, a cartwheel in the corridor, a voice kept low on purpose so it would not travel. By then, the sleeping ward had already done its hidden work. It had held the night inside a pattern of watchfulness and let sleep exist as something guarded, shared, and temporary, while the rest of the house continued to move beyond the door. Long before sleep was carried into the laboratory, it lived here in the lamp, the basin, the register, and the slow walk from bed to bed. The night nurse did not explain sleep in theory. The night nurse kept it possible in practice. That practical labor matters because it shows how much the room participates in rest. A bed, a light, a page in a book, a door that closes without slamming, a basin set down without a rattle, a circuit made in time to catch a problem before it grows larger. These are the conditions under which sleep can gather itself and keep. In the sleeping ward, rest was never only the body's private act. It was a small institution assembled for a few hours and taken apart again at dawn. A little farther from the sleeping ward, behind a door with a soft latch, another room took up the work of night. The bed shared it with a narrow table, a roll of paper, a recorder, a clock, and the small connections that turned a sleeping head into something the room could listen to. Rest had entered a place of measurement. The laboratory did not ask sleep to speak in words. It asked for a line. For a long time, sleep had been understood through habits, dreams, heaviness, and nerves under strain. The laboratory did not erase that history, but it added a different witness. Electrical activity from the scalp could be carried to paper. The sleeper stayed unseen in one sense and newly visible in another. A trace without a voice could still show that something was happening. Sleep became less like a private pause and more like a process with edges. That mattered because sleeplessness had often lived between suffering and certainty. A person could describe a long night, and a physician could still be left with speech alone. The laboratory promised a common surface where complaint and record could meet. It did not solve uncertainty. It gave uncertainty a format. Once sleep could be put on paper, it could be compared, filed, and brought back into daylight. The paper mattered as much as the signal. A moving strip gave the night a route. Each turn of the clock, each motion in the room, Each pause of the recorder left a mark that could be read later by lamplight. The chart changed sleep from a passing event into a document. The night was no longer only remembered, it was inscribed. The room had to be made fit for that work. Light stayed low, doors were opened and closed carefully. A step in the corridor, a scrape of a chair, or an overbright lamp could break the pattern. Quiet had long belonged to rest cures and sleeping wards, but here, quiet became part of method. The laboratory tried to make the night repeatable, with the same room, paper, and conditions, so one trace could be set beside another without confusion. This changed the language around exhaustion and insomnia. Fatigue, nervous strain, poor rest, broken sleep, and wakeful hours could now be discussed beside traces, intervals, and shapes. Older explanations did not disappear. Work, grief, heat, noise, worry, and city pressure still mattered. But once the night was visible on a chart, sleeplessness began to look less like a vague failing and more like a pattern that could be studied. The laboratory did not remove the human story. It gave the story a new surface. Often the laboratory was not an isolated house, but a room attached to a hospital, a clinic, or a department already used to studying the nerves and the brain. That location mattered. Sleep entered medicine through corridors where other troubles had already been made into cases. Headaches, weakness, exhaustion, and anxious complaint had their own files. The sleeping patient became one more kind of patient, and the chart on the table joined the bedside note in a larger medical paper trail. The laboratory also made room for contradiction. A person could say that sleep had never come, while the paper showed stretches of quiet. Another might feel that the night had been nearly empty of rest, and still produce a trace with pauses and deepening sections. The instrument did not settle the argument. It placed the testimony side by side. One witness came from inside the experience, the other from outside it. Between them, sleep became less simple and more legible. That legibility gave the chart a kind of authority. It could be shown to another physician, folded into a file, compared against an earlier night, or discussed after the patient had gone. A record that began at the bedside could travel into a cabinet and stay there. In that movement, sleep acquired a second life. It was still something lived, but it was also something stored. The drawer, the folder, and the clipped label became part of the history of the night. Older ways of watching had not vanished. Before the electrical trace, physicians had listened to breathing, counted pulse, watched movement, and tried to infer rest from the body as a whole. The laboratory gathered those habits rather than replacing them. Breath, motion, and pulse still mattered because sleep never belonged to the brain alone. Several small witnesses could now be brought together on one page, so the night could be read as an assembled set of signals instead of a single impression. That made it easier to speak of lighter, deeper, interrupted, or returning rest. The city outside the laboratory mattered too. Industrial schedules, lamps, late hours, and the pressure of work had already made fatigue a public concern. The laboratory offered a quieter authority than complaint alone. It could place a sleepless night next to a pattern, a line, and a time. What had once sounded like a moral shortcoming or a private weakness could now appear as a matter for observation and comparison. The night inside the laboratory also depended on a small human arrangement. One person had to stay awake so that another could sleep under supervision. Someone set the chart in motion, someone watched the paper run, someone wrote down the time, the movement, the brief disturbance, the moment of waking. The sleeping ward had already been an institution built for the night. The laboratory made that institution more exact. Its work depended on patience, and patience had a clerical side to it. Wakefulness kept the record alive. That clerical side mattered because the laboratory produced an archive by accident. By morning, there was paper with a night on it, several sheets, each carrying a different section of the same hours. They had to be dated, labeled, and kept flat so the line would not smudge. The date mattered, as did the room number, the initials, and the hour at which sleep began. Even so, the laboratory never became the whole world of rest. Quiet bedrooms, sanatorium routines, and sleeping wards framed sleep. The lab stood beside them and changed the balance of authority. A private room could still matter, and so could a supervised ward. But the chart in the cabinet gave a night another life in daylight. A line that began in darkness could be unfolded under a lamp, and compared with other lines, what had been fleeting became repeatable enough to study, and the words for rest would soon have to catch up. The night was no longer only something that vanished, it had become something that could remain. The next room is not a bedroom, it is a records room, with casebooks upright and index cards in shallow drawers. The paper has softened at the corners. Ink has sunk into a narrow vocabulary, written by hands meant for later readers. In those lines, sleep is no longer only the disappearance of a day. It is complaint, relief, risk, recovery, and sometimes a word that has to be negotiated. One hand writes rest, another fatigue, another exhaustion, another nerves. The same unease moves from term to term, as if each were trying to carry more burden than the last. Older words never disappeared cleanly. Repose, ease, respite, stillness, slumber, quiet, and rest lived in sermons, poems, household speech, and bedside conversation before they entered medical files. Medicine borrowed them and set them beside newer terms. Rest could mean a pause, a treatment, a stage in recovery, or a state a physician wanted to name. It sat between ordinary life and clinical judgment, sounding gentle in one room and strict in another, and carrying authority. A patient might say only that he was tired, worn out, or unable to settle. The chart could turn that into fatigue, nervous weakness, sleeplessness, or exhaustion. Once separated, the words could be compared and attached to causes like grief, overwork, worry, a change of scene, or a body recovering or declining. A short night, grief, overwork, or too much company could all be folded into it. The language of rest began sorting experience into categories. What had been feeling became description, then debate. Nerves did a great deal of work. It could join sleep, appetite, irritability, headache, and strain without settling what came first. In late 19th century medicine, it became a bridge between ordinary tiredness and diagnosis. For some people, that bridge was a relief. For others, it felt narrowing. Nerves could explain too much and too little at once, making a complaint legible or vague. The word promised order, but it carried uncertainty into the household. That uncertainty showed where rest became a regimen. In a bed, on a chair, behind a curtain, or in a quiet room, rest could be treated as cure, discipline, or endurance. Sanatoriums and convalescent homes gave it a timetable. Meals at fixed hours, walks, silence, reading, lying down. The routine taught language too. People spoke in the units the place offered: bed, air, quiet, walk, hour, interval, room. Rest was no longer a blank pause. It became a sequence of named actions, and the names carried authority. The rest cure showed how much could be hidden inside that authority. In one setting, rest looked like protection and care. In another, like confinement. The difference depended on who could step out of work, afford a nurse, or keep a spare room, and who was still expected to answer letters, make meals, or tend to others. The vocabulary sounded neutral on the page, but it moved through class and gender with uneven force. A bed might mean recovery in one house and interruption in another. Even the same instruction could sound like mercy in one room and confinement in another. Outside the private room, the industrial city gave fatigue a larger audience. Factory bells, streetcars, shops, offices, schools, and crowded stairs fed a language of strain that was no longer only personal. Reformers, teachers, employers, and physicians used fatigue differently. A worker at the end of a shift, a child bent over lessons, or the pace of modern life itself. Rest became part of a wider argument about labor, pace, attention, and the cost of being busy. The city appeared in the sentence as much as the person did. That wider argument also entered forms and ledgers. A clinic sheet could ask about hours slept, broken sleep, early waking, or restlessness. A school register could mark absence and lateness. A household notebook could track nights that passed badly and mornings that began in fog. Once sleep and rest were written down in standard places, they could be counted, compared, and discussed apart from the moment in which they happened. The point was not only to record, but to make the same experience readable across more than one person. The night became a file entry, copied, summarized, or reviewed under another lamp. This was one of the quieter changes in medical history, a private condition, learning how to live on paper. The same movement reached diaries and letters where the language stayed uneven. A person might write that sleep came in fragments, the body felt heavy, the house was too loud, or the mind would not settle. A doctor might write improved, less restless, more composed, or still fatigued. Two registers could circle the same evening without touching. One held experience, the other classification. Neither was complete on its own. The words for rest decided which version entered the record and which stayed in the room. The difference could be small in spelling and large in consequence. Medical writing also began to sound more exact because the page itself was changing. Printed headings, ruled columns, and standardized spaces encouraged people to answer in certain shapes. If there was a box for sleep, a line for fatigue, a slot for nervous symptoms, or a place for remarks, the language followed the space. A complaint that had once arrived in a long paragraph could be compressed into a phrase. That compression was not harmless. It made comparison possible, so one case could be set beside another, one night against another, one ward against another. The page had become a tool for sorting. The page could no longer keep only a story. Rest was no longer a single state, but a category that had to fit the format. Rest became entangled with questions of privilege and permission. To take rest, or to need rest, could sound simple in print and impossible in practice. It meant something different in a house with spare rooms than in a crowded one, in a life with servants than in a life without them, in a convalescent home than in a workroom, in a family willing to reduce demands than in one that could not do without every pair of hands. The language itself did not solve those differences. A body that could rest could be praised as recovering. A body that could not might be read as failing. The old accusation of laziness sat close to the new language of recovery, and the word rest sounded softer than it was. A slight change in wording could carry a much larger consequence. By the time these words had moved through casebooks, sanatorium timetables, school registers, factory talk, and household notes, the language of rest had changed shape. It was no longer a single term beside sleep, but a field of distinctions: fatigue and exhaustion, nerves and strain, quiet and idleness, recovery and refusal, convalescence and collapse. Some words made suffering easier to name, some harder, and none were final. The change mattered because language decides what can be asked, recorded, and recognized as real. The old hush of the night was no longer enough. Rest had to be spoken of in daylight, compared across lives, and given a place on the page. The lamp still burned over the ledger, and the page held more than sleep now. The arguments people made about what rest was, who could claim it, and what it might mean when a body asked for more of it. The card index sits beside the ledger in the reading room, another memory of paper and tabs. Under the lamp, each tab marks a category, but none holds the whole night. One drawer turns sleep into complaint, another into routine, another into fatigue, another into the quieter language of rest. A page can be opened and closed. A drawer can be searched, refiled, and returned. That is how the late history of sleep often appears in institutions, not as one story, but as repeated entries, trimmed for storage. The room is small enough that the desk seems to gather the light. The lamp throws a pale circle over the ledger and index. On the wall, a timetable keeps the day in order. Meals, rounds, visits, silence. It does not explain why any of it matters. It only shows how a day is partitioned, so rest has to fit itself inside the plan. Earlier words were broader. Nerves could mean strain, weakness, fear, weariness, or pressure. Rest could mean bed, withdrawal, convalescence, retreat, or the hope that a body might settle if left alone long enough. By the time the card index and casebook take over, it is broken into smaller pieces: insomnia, fatigue, wakefulness, disturbed sleep. The newer language does not cancel the older one. It sits beside it. A patient may still speak of nerves while the record asks for hours. A physician may still write of rest while the form asks for symptoms. The labels matter because they move attention. A note about nerves can sound like temperament. A note about fatigue can sound like labor. A note about insomnia can sound like the night itself becoming the site of trouble. Each word opens a different drawer in the physician's mind. None is innocent. Each brings expectations about the body, the mind, work, and blame. The person who is tired is not necessarily understood, but the change still alters what can be asked, compared, and stored. The sanatorium gave that language a built environment. Air, meals, stillness, and set hours made rest seem architectural. A path to the garden, a bench, an open window, a blanket were only arrangements. They show how much rest depended on place, weather, and permission. Yet even there, sleep did not settle into a simple routine. One person might lie awake, another might sleep deeply, another might feel the silence as pressure. The institution could arrange the frame, but the night kept its private movement inside it. The ward at night made that plain in a different way. A nurse passing a door sees only a strip of light under the curtain, a glass on the table, the slow turn of a shoulder beneath the sheet. The chart records what the eye can manage, not what the mind is feeling. Silence is not empty. It holds the ticking clock, the radiator, a distant footstep, a sheet being straightened, a cough held back and released again. Sleep lives among those sounds rather than apart from them. The record may say asleep or awake, but the night is fuller than the line can keep. The electric lamp changes the evening without removing it. Light lets work push farther into the night. Darkness no longer arrives all at once. It is delayed, then summoned. A bedside lamp, a hallway bulb, and a desk light can make the evening feel scheduled. The same light that lets people read also lets them keep going. Sleep has to claim its place against a brighter resistance. In the laboratory, the room changes again. Curtains give way to instruments and charts. The bed remains, but it sits beneath another kind of attention. Sleep is observed, traced, timed, and compared. The question is no longer only whether a person rested, but how the body moved. The room becomes exacting because the method is exacting, yet the older uncertainty stays. A graph can show rhythm, interruption, and pattern, but no trace can fully carry the dark. The numbers do not end the problem. They only give it another surface. A collection of books, manuscripts, photographs, and case notes keeps these differences side by side. One shelf holds a treatise on nerves, another a report on sleep, another a folder of patient notes or charts. Words that once seemed precise now look provisional. Words that once seemed private now look administrative. The archive does not straighten the past into a single line. It leaves the arguments intact, filed next to one another, so they can still be compared. That comparison reaches beyond the room. Once sleep can be named, it can be compared. Once compared, it can be counted. Once counted, it can be tied to work, illness, family life, and the demands of the day. Long hours in factories or offices, interrupted nights in hospitals, and the fatigue of care push sleep out of the private bedroom and into public language. The body becomes more visible, and visibility brings judgment, authority, and sometimes neglect. Not everyone entered that language with the same ease. Some bodies were expected to keep working, some to keep house, some to care for others, some to remain still under instruction. Rest could be prescribed, denied, or made into a luxury. The records seldom confess this plainly, but the pattern is there in the way some people are sent to bed and others are sent back to labor. Even a room made for quiet can carry old rules about who deserves it. The same change in language also alters what counts as proof. A doctor's impression matters less when forms, charts, and records ask for repetition. A single complaint about sleeplessness can be set against nights of observation. A rest cure can be described through its routine rather than its promise. A quiet room can be praised because it reduces movement, conversation, and interruption. Recording does not end uncertainty. It gives uncertainty a filing place. There is a particular quiet in those drawers. Cards are stacked too neatly to fall, but not so tightly that they stop sounding when touched. A report is pulled free, read, and returned. In that small motion, a life passes from speech to paper and back again. The room does not ask for drama. It asks only for the hand to keep moving, for the ledger to be closed after the line is written, for the lamp to keep its circle a little longer. Outside the reading room, the corridor has already begun to empty. Linen is folded, cups are collected, the last rounds are finished. Darkness in an institution is not the same as darkness outdoors. It is managed by lamps, switches, and the strips of light under doors. Even so, the building settles, the day's order loosens, and sleep enters not as a cure, but as the ordinary permission of darkness. What remains is the older human problem that is kept returning in different clothes. Rest is never only biological, never only social, never only a matter of beds or schedules. It is also a question of who may speak, who is believed, who is given time, and who is told that tiredness is a failing of character. The questions move through homes, clinics, hospitals, sanatoriums, and laboratories. A lamp, a chart, and a card index can keep them for a while, but they are larger than any one room, so the final light belongs to the room rather than the argument. The lamp over the ledger dims the paper dims the room, the drawer closes, the index loses its edges, the record keeps its place, but the eye can no longer read it. That is how the old night returns after being measured and described. The body lowers itself, the room grows quiet, and the page waits without explanation. The lamp goes out, and the room returns to the dark, where sleep has always been older than its names. The cards remain stacked, the ledger remains closed, and the silence holds the rest of it.